Hi, I'm Ray Scott, your always friendly neighborhood photographer, and welcome to Visual Art Photography Tutorials. Composition is one of those things that's really hard to get your head around, especially when you're a new photographer. But it's even difficult for people who've been shooting for decades. Composition is something that you always have to look at to try to improve at. There are so many different elements to composition. That's why I have a playlist on this channel dedicated solely to composition. And today's tutorial is going to be about an element of composition, angular and oblique lines. Angular and oblique lines can be a powerful tool in your composition arsenal. Now, the trick is to identify them and then to use them effectively to make your images even better. Now, as usual, if you have any comments or questions, you can address those down below. Let's get started on angular and oblique lines. Composition is really a thinking person's aspect of photography. You know something, you can have the best camera equipment, you can have all kinds of things going on, but if you can't get a good composition together, you're in trouble. And there are so many different aspects, as I mentioned off the top of the show. This one is about angular lines and oblique lines. And more specifically, when we're talking about angles, we're talking about diagonal lines. And I just love diagonal lines because they just add a dynamic to images. And it's a wonderful thing, I think. I use them a lot in my photography. You'll notice that a lot. So you have diagonal lines here. Okay? That's the way they're working here. How about over here? Same thing, diagonal running here and like this. Now, these are not necessarily oblique, they are perpendicular to each other. We're going to be talking about oblique lines shortly. But the diagonal leads you in, that's one thing it does, and of course the shadows here are giving you an interesting pattern as well. More diagonal, right here, the clothesline. All right? It just adds something. You also have this in terms of diagonal. It's coming in like this. This leads you in as well. You see the common theme here. Diagonal. Staircase. You have all kinds of stuff going on here too. You know, these are actually oblique lines, but you have your diagonal there. Now, here's where it starts to get really interesting as you start to compose your images and you're looking for lines, and specifically here, oblique lines. Now, oblique lines are basically lines that run at angles to each other. Now, you have parallel lines, of course, and you have perpendicular lines running at 180 degrees. You know, this is like your perpendicular here, that sort of thing. Well, we're not talking about that. We're talking about oblique. And oblique lines run at angles to each other. So look at this. This here is running at an angle to this here, which is also this, of course. And then you have another one here. Okay, so you have these oblique lines that are running at angles to each other. And if you can pick out these things when you're doing your photography, you can make some interesting things, and you'll notice some similarities. Now watch this. Okay, so you see this. You see these lines that I pointed out. Now look at a completely different shot, but yet it is so very similar. So similar. Oblique lines. You also have them over here, of course, but this is something a little bit different. But look, the similarity. Okay, you can look at it again. Same sort of thing. Oblique lines. And once you start identifying these things and working them into your photography, it can really add something. Awareness in photography, awareness in compositions. It's here again. A little more subtle, a completely different subject though. I mean, this is like totally different than your landscape photo. Ray of light coming down here. Oblique lines. Oblique lines. Different angles. Over here, this one, look at this. They're coming from all over the place. Look, oblique lines running at angles to each other. Oblique lines. You can find them everywhere. Even tree shadows. These lines are running at angles to each other. Look. Even here, the tree branches. Look. Oblique lines. They're running at all kinds of different angles. This is, I guess, probably the most obvious thing, trees. But when you think about it, it makes sense. Now you can use shadows as well for oblique lines. Look. Right there. Shadows. Oblique lines. And of course you have a shape. Triangle. But that's another tutorial, okay? Oblique lines today. And angular lines. Now, we've had angular lines, more specifically diagonal lines. We've had oblique lines, lines running at different angles to each other. And now, implied lines. There is no actual diagonal here or angular line, but you know there is one. I mean, you can see it, you can feel it, right? That's the implied line. We've been talking about literal lines up to this point, but this is the implied line. These are not connected, but you know there's a line there. Your eye sees it. So that's the diagonal here, and it's an implied line. So you have, now we know we have literal lines and we have implied lines. More implied lines. Now you have the definite line here. Okay, we know that's a line, but that's only one line. How about this? Oblique and implied. These hay bales are not connected. There is no actual literal line there, but you know there's a line there. Your eye sees it, but you just have to be aware of it and point it out to yourself so that you can see that there is actually a line there. And it actually turns out to be a check mark, actually, in this particular case. This is a little bit more difficult to see, but there are implied lines here. Can you see it? Implied lines. And they add a dynamic to your image. They really, really do. That's not implied over here. That's an actual line up top. But these are the implied lines down here with the bales. Okay? And they're not connected again, but they are there. Look at these black-eyed Susans. It almost looks like they're radiating out from the tree. Look. Look at all these lines. They're all implied. Nothing's connected. But if you look, you can see them and feel them. The implied lines are almost a feeling. But once you get your eye on it, you can see it. Typical landscape. There are no straight lines here, but it's full of implied lines, right? We know this isn't straight, but that's the implied line, right? Over here, same thing. All kinds of lines being implied here. They're not straight, but they're there, and they happen to be oblique as well. So, literal lines, implied lines, angular lines, oblique lines. Lines are everywhere, and it's great to be aware of them because they can really add a lot to your composition. Always being aware of what's going on in your viewfinder is of paramount importance when it comes to composition. Angular and oblique lines are just a couple of elements that you can use and be aware of to make your photography even better. Until next time, I'm Ray Scott reminding you, it's not what you see, it's how you see it. And I'll see you soon.